Oddworld Munches Exoddus was one of the many unreleased games by Oddworld Inhabitants that was meant to be made after Oddworld Munches Odyssey, following the tradition established by Oddworld Abe's Exoddus coming out after Abe's Odyssey to have a bonus game following an installment of the main Oddworld quintology story. Munches Exoddus was planned as a side game to carry on the story of Munch following the events of the ending of Munches Odyssey. Munches Exoddus would have seen Munch travel to a place known as Mar Spa, believed to be the source of the Mongo River, which is the same river that much of Oddworld Stranger's Wrath takes place by, or in even. But it's apparently a really massive long river, so that doesn't necessarily mean Munches Exoddus takes place anywhere near the Stranger's Wrath locations, it just happens to be connected to the same river. Mar Spa is the birthing place of gabbits, who spend the first part of their life there as tiny gabbywogs. As a result, it's a very revered place as all gabbits start life here, which is why it would have been Munch's mission in this game to take the can of Gabbyar gabbit eggs that he got at the end of Munch's Odyssey and go to Mar Spa to hatch them to revive and repopulate his race, truly proving himself as the chosen one of his species. Apparently, gabbywogs eventually retreat to an area called the Spawning Springs, where they develop lungs and grow into fully sized gabbits and head off into the ocean, to be fished and netted to death by the Vikers. Although, as far as I know, not referenced anywhere as appearing in the game, I reckon the Spawning Springs would have been a place you visited in Munches Exoddus, considering that it presumably is pretty close to Mar Spa, and plus this concept art here, which apparently is of this game, shows what looks like a spring, at least to me. I also wonder if Mar Spa is populated by Mudokons, as there are many of them witnessed in the concept art by the looks of it, but also this here is of a device known as a song engine, which is apparently an ancient Mudokon natural defensive structure. It would reportedly harness nature's energy as water flows through it to create spiritual music, which it uses to welcome allies and ward off enemies. Using chimes and drums, it can be brought to life and its powers reach as far as the music can be heard. So whether this is at Mar Spa or not, who knows. I'm assuming it is though, considering it's surrounded by water and is in concept art for what is apparently Munches Exoddus, so it definitely seems reasonable to believe so, I'd say. Not to mention, most of this kind of concept art seems to depict the characters traversing via the branches of a massive tree, reminds me of Bug's Life, surrounded by water and waterfalls. It seems to be a common theme throughout most of these pieces of art that are supposedly from Munches Exoddus. Despite never actually being made, Oddworld Inhabitants did have a concept document for Munches Exoddus, but it's somewhat disputed whether the game actually went into production, with many people assuming that it didn't even get to that point and was simply an idea. Which is understandable considering the title Oddworld Munches Exoddus was simply the next logical step, the following part of the pattern that Oddworld had followed up to that point. So even if Oddworld Inhabitants right from the beginning never had any intentions to make an Oddworld Munches Exoddus, that title would still exist and be in people's heads just because of the pattern set previously with Abe's Odyssey and Abe's Exoddus, which I think is kind of an interesting thing to think about. But that wasn't the case. It actually was a game that Oddworld Inhabitants intended to make, and although many people cite it as never having reached any stage of actual development, I actually believe, from what I've read researching this video, that it seemingly did actually enter production in some form, with at least one build of the game even being built, which I'll talk about later. Though interestingly, the earlier you go back prior to the release of Munches Odyssey, the more assured the release of this bonus game seemed. Which makes sense considering it would have made extensive use of Munches Odyssey's assets and engine. This was kind of the point of these in-between games by this time. Oddworld Inhabitants expected that it would take a very long time to make the next part of the quintology Oddworld Squeak's Odyssey, to the point that the technology to do all that they wanted with it may not have even existed at the time, and as a result it made sense to do a Munches Exoddus in the meantime. And indeed, technology likely plays a large part in my estimation in the story of Munches Exoddus's development, or lack thereof, with the game originally intended, much like its predecessor, to come out on the PlayStation 2. Oddworld creator Lorne Lanning spoke about this at the time, saying, "The whole Oddworld quintology will not come to an end in the 128-bit console era. Certainly Munches Exoddus will be on the PS2, along with some other Oddworld games, but it's too soon to talk about them. As for Squeak's Odyssey and the next Oddysee, we're not sure if they will run on PS2. And likewise, going back to the idea of Munches Exoddus being a way to allow Oddworld inhabitants to take their time on Squeak's Odyssey, a preview of Munches Odyssey back in May 2000 says, Oddworld promises a second part to Munch's story that will also be a PS2 game. Apparently it sees developing this second game as a way to stall making the third in the quintology. Indeed, despite the Exoddus games originally existing only because after Abe's Odyssey the publishers wanted a new game out within a year and Oddworld inhabitants were unable to make Munches Odyssey as they wanted in that time frame, these games had now become a way of getting the most out of the technology that they'd built for the quintology installments. Lorne spoke about this in an interview with GameFan in April 2000, saying, "We have the whole studio here focused on that one goal. And that's why I'm saying, when we look at the milestones, the play patterns, if we get Munch done, we've got 85% of Hand of Odd done, and 80% of Munches Exoddus is done. And the quality of the games will be enough that people won't say, yeah, they're done, but they didn't seem like it. We get to tune so many different types of experiences from this one infrastructure technology. You couldn't think this way on a 16-bit or 32-bit. The technology wasn't enough to think this way. It was too isolated, too specific, but I think you're afforded the luxury now to think this way." He spoke more about this in June 2001, saying they were working on Munches Exoddus because each new original chapter of the quintology will undoubtedly require real technological innovation, as is the case between Abe's Odyssey and Munches Odyssey. It takes time between each chapter to let the technology progress. We will therefore make several games with the technology developed for Munch before moving on to the next one. Anyway, my designers are asking for it. Ultimately, Munches Exoddus's fate was in the hands of its predecessor, Munches Odyssey. Both the reason Munches Exoddus existed in the first place, and likely the reason it failed to come to fruition in the end. Not getting along with the technology of the PlayStation 2, late in production, Oddworld Inhabitants switched development of Munches Odyssey to the Xbox, and this kind of threw everything up in the air, I'd say. As Lorne said, if we get Munch done, 80% of Munches Exoddus is done, but ultimately that Munches Odyssey was not exactly what was expected. Some could say it wasn't done, and so much of what it was meant to be was cut out of the final game. Despite this, Munches Exoddus was still planned to be made at this stage, with Lanning saying they'd be taking a break after Munches Odyssey, but immediately after we will move on to Munches Exoddus. In an interview on Overgame.com from the summer of 2001, when asked if there will be a non-quintology sequel for Munch like there was for Abe, he replied yes, after Munches Odyssey there will be Munches Exoddus before Hand of Odd. But after Munches Odyssey came out, seemingly the concept of Munches Exoddus was reworked by Oddworld Inhabitants as being designed to fill in the gaps of some of the cut concepts and plot elements that were intended to be in Munches Odyssey. Now, one thing that I find interesting is that from what I remember and have researched, there seems to be different accounts as to whether Munches Exoddus would have featured Munch on his own or would have had Abe in as well. Personally, considering Abe plays such a larger role than Munch in Munches Odyssey, in Munch's own game, I'd have liked to see Munch on his own carrying a game by himself. And if Munches Exoddus would have been like this, then we would have been able to munch on much more of Munch in Munches Exoddus than we managed to munch on Munch in Munches Odyssey. But whether or not this was the case is seemingly up for debate. Some people recite the plot and say it features Munch going to Marspar, but others say it has Munch and Abe travelling to Marspar. And likewise, I've seen concept art. This one here is apparently on Marspar and clearly shows Munch on his own. Meanwhile, you've got the others that I believe are of Munches Exoddus, and the dates saying they're from mid-2001 adds up for me, and certainly don't look like anything from Munches Odyssey, or at least anywhere that appeared in the final game of Munches Odyssey, but these pretty clearly show Munch with Abe on an adventure. Now, one of the plot elements that is generally cited to be in Munches Exoddus was that Abe's mother, the Mudokan Queen Sam, was going to be in it. Now, hearing this when I was younger, it always seemed odd to me to have Munch, especially if it was on his own, meet Abe's mother. You know, it sort of seemed like just a really strange story element, especially considering how massive a plot point that is to have in a bonus game about Munch. But now, understanding the context of Munches Exoddus was reworked to fill in the concepts that didn't make it into Munches Odyssey, such as meeting Abe's mother, it actually makes a lot of sense to me. And as a result, I reckon that the reason it's sort of ambiguous whether Abe was going to be in it or not is because I think that originally it was going to be Munch on his own, but after Munches Odyssey came out in the not so complete state it was intended, and Munches Exoddus was reworked, Abe was then inserted into it, along with missing Munches Odyssey story elements, to continue the story that they wanted to tell that way instead. Which begs the question, what other plot elements that were cut from Munch's first game were going to appear in Munches Exoddus? Perhaps the return of Moloch the Glutton would have happened, and his subsequent trial against his mother, Glutton Queen Lady Margaret. However, it wasn't just cut story elements that were intended to be used instead in Munch's second game, with axed gameplay components expected to be integrated as well. In September 2001, a couple of months before the release of Munches Odyssey, in response to fans talking about pictures from Munches Odyssey promotion showing Glutton and Mudokken's statuses, Alf said, "The pictures you are referring to are production art for Munches Odyssey. Many of these images and concepts did not make the cut. Final game does not include many of the status images. Look for these to show up in Munches Exoddus." Considering Abe's Exoddus vastly improved on the gameplay from Abe's Odyssey, it's reasonable to assume the intention was for Munches Exoddus to do the same for Munches Odyssey, so it's worth considering what other gameplay mechanics would have been included and expanded upon in the game. Any number of the features that didn't make it into Munches Odyssey could have technically been included in this second part, so it'd be interesting to find out what Oddworld Inhabitants were thinking at the time regarding this. Reportedly, Munches Exoddus would have featured new gameplay mechanics such as Munch being able to swim underwater, but I think the source of this suggestion is not remotely substantial and is just fan theorising, like pretty much anything I say. But that being said, I could definitely imagine that that'd be a logical enhancement to include, especially in a game that is Gabbit oriented in both the story and the gameplay, particularly if Munch was the only main character. From 2002, in reference to Hand of Odd, Squeak's Odyssey and Munches Exoddus, the Oddworld website stated in its frequently asked questions page, "We are currently not in production on those titles at this time. Oddworld is presently working on a title that is concurrent with the evolution of the quintology, but unique from our previous games. So even though it is unlike anything we've released so far, we think you will agree it couldn't have come from anyone but Oddworld." So it seems that very soon after release of Oddworld Munches Odyssey, Munches Exoddus was shelved, and Oddworld Inhabitants fully began work on what was presumably Oddworld Stranger's Wrath. And interestingly, according to Stuart Gilray in a 2013 interview with Official Xbox Magazine, Stranger's Wrath was originally conceived as a direct sequel to Munches Odyssey, with Gilray saying, "Stranger's Wrath was Munches Exoddus, and actually there is a build somewhere on Xbox which has Stranger and Munch hopping around the world, and it's like, okay, this is a bit weird now." So it's really interesting that there even exists a build seemingly of Oddworld Munches Exoddus, which is in direct contrast, I would say, to the general assumption that the game was just an idea and never even started production. And I just realised this whole thing actually makes a lot of sense when you consider that Munches Exoddus was intended to take place around the Mongo River, and then Stranger's Wrath does take place around the Mongo River. And also, in concept art seemingly for Munches Exoddus, Abe and Munch are shown being guided along the Mongo River by native, who I presume are Mudokkans, who are wearing a very specific sort of hat that's kind of familiar because the grubs in Stranger's Wrath, who are natives that guide Stranger along the Mongo River, also wear this exact hat. So even though Munches Exoddus never came to fruition, I think it's fair to say that really surprisingly, its DNA somewhat is present in Stranger's Wrath. To some small degree anyway, there's seemingly evidence that Stranger's Wrath came out of Munches Exoddus, which is really fascinating. My theory is that Oddworld Inhabitants were working on Munch's Exoddus and somehow the character of Stranger was added to it. Maybe they felt it was necessary for there to be another character with Munch as a replacement of Abe for whatever reason, so Stranger came about as seen in the aforementioned build. And then maybe somewhere early in development, Lorne was just like, okay, actually let's just fully go with this Stranger character and do something totally different. Perhaps due to the public reception of Munches Odyssey. You know, it makes sense that potentially they'd be like, well, why are we doing a similar thing to Munches Odyssey when it didn't go down so well? We need to change it up completely. And so by 2002, they'd switched development to Stranger's Wrath. And as a result, Munches Exoddus itself never happened. Same old story, after Stranger's Wrath, Oddworld Inhabitants shuts its doors, and the Oddworld games aren't revived until 2010 when Just Add Water started developing the HD remasters. But naturally, there was a gap that could be filled. People had been waiting for nearly a decade for the next installment. What came after Munches Odyssey? Some people thought maybe Munches Exoddus would perhaps finally see the light of day, especially as Munches Odyssey HD was one of the remasters being done. But in 2011, Alf said that our schedule doesn't have a slot for Munches Exoddus right now. In 2013, Oddworld did a poll to see what fans wanted them to do next, and Munches Exoddus only got 601 votes, coming third from the bottom, looking even worse for the fate of the game. But the real death blow for it is, of course, the reboot of the Quintology. Not that that's a bad thing, just that it's a bad thing for Munches Exoddus. As with Oddworld New and Tasty and then Oddworld Soulstorm coming along as a new canon of the Quintology story, it makes no sense for Oddworld Inhabitants to ever go back and develop Oddworld Munches Exoddus, as Munches Odyssey didn't happen at least the same way yet in this new timeline. I think it's a great shame as a result that Munches Exoddus didn't happen and that specific story and timeline never got past Munches Odyssey. But the design document for the game still exists, so with both Munch and Stranger, according to Lorne Lanning, supposedly playing a role in the next stages of the new Quintology, it's possible that elements of Munches Exoddus may find their way into future Oddworld games.
Hello, follow me.